session 2. I was very excited to have this on the program when we were putting this agenda together because I'm really not sure what to expect, but it's going to be good. It'll be Dan Britt, Human and Robotic Mission Operations Overview. Whatever happened to the future?
It's more than a little bit intimidating to follow Jack Schmidt at the best of times, and talking about whatever happened to the future makes me even more intimidated, but I will give it a shot. What I'd really want to talk about is whatever happened to our visions of the future. Because when I was a kid, there were all sorts of visions of the future that, massive habitats, moon bases, asteroid mining, exploration, and it always seemed about 20 or 30 years in the future. And the problem is the future always remained about 20 or 30 years away. And so what I'm going to share with you is my own peculiar point of view on some of these issues. This is by far not a comprehensive list, but I want to highlight a few of these things. And the GAO just released another report about their criticisms of NASA. I added that to my list. I have 3 of them now, pretty much saying the same thing. And a lot of this is not in the GAO report because it's a little bit too high level. But fundamentally, the future is far away because of more or less 5 things: cost, the political cycle versus the planning cycle, the rocket equation, launch costs, and development cycles, the tyranny of technology readiness levels. So cost. Fundamentally, exploration is not cheap. This is human programs in FY $10. The mountain over here is Apollo, and Space Shuttle occupied my young adulthood. These things are not cheap. International Space Station was $150 billion. The shuttle was about $210. None of this is cheap. Politics. Exploration takes a long time relative to political cycles. It takes political capital to get big projects together. So my example is the Apollo program. May 25th, 1961, Kennedy called for getting a human to the moon before the decade was out. This is the guy that actually made it happen, Lyndon Johnson. Jack is old enough to remember that Lyndon Johnson was the senator from NASA back before he became vice president. That was his thing. He made this happen. Whose name is on the moon? I can tell you, Jack probably remembers this, Richard Nixon was no fan of Lyndon Johnson or any of Lyndon Johnson's acts. And so one of the things that Dick Nixon wanted to do was cancel Apollo as soon as possible. In fact, he canceled the mission that Jack was originally scheduled for. Jack was scheduled for Apollo 18. 18, 19, and 20, they'd already bought the hardware. Dick Nixon did not want to pay for the fuel. That's a fundamental problem. You spend your political capital, and it's unlikely that you will be around to reap the rewards. Actually, the Apollo program was fast compared to most development cycles. The moon landing between May 61 and July 69, that was 8 years and 2 months. That was really fast. The problem is presidents at the best last for 8 years. All the others are vastly longer than that. Space Station Freedom, some of us remember Space Station Freedom. It never flew. The planning alone without actually doing anything was 9 years. So that's one of the features that we have. The gear ratio problem. You want to deliver anything to a distant place, it's going to take a lot more kilos of stuff to get 1 kilo there. The gear ratio problem for delivering something to the surface of Mars is more than 200 kilos of fuel, rocket, support structure. So the big problem is that we're at the bottom of gravity well. Every kilo that you deliver of payload is going to require several hundred kilos of overhead. And so you're going to be fighting the rocket equation every step of the way. The way to get around that is you divide up your mass. You take the smart mass, which is computers, life support, electronics, humans, and you take that and you get your dumb mass locally, the water, the air, the propellant, the shielding, building materials, whatever. This is why people talk about in situ resource utilization. It's one way to get around very high costs of moving things around. It used to be that launches were really not cheap. I used to be an economist in my former life. I would predict that if you only have two companies competing against each other, and those companies happen to be named Lockheed and Boeing, that your costs are going to be high because they will meet at the side, off to the side, and think of ways of charging you more money. And of course, that is exactly what happened when Lockheed and Boeing combined to be the United Launch Alliance, and you ended up having prices per kilo of in the 5 figures. But things have changed. We've got some new actors. SpaceX in particular, Blue Origin, have changed the face of the launch business. And so instead of $10,000 a kilo, we're looking at a couple $1,000s per kilo. That's still not very cheap, but I will take order of magnitude reductions where I can find them. We're building the Space Launch System. I think the most optimistic forecast is $15,000 to $20,000 a kilo. I frankly don't even believe that. That's going to be fantastically expensive, and it's going to have to compete with these commercial actors, which are going to be vastly cheaper. The tyranny of TRL, that's technology readiness levels. For those of you that don't know about TRL, you need to learn this stuff. For the students in this room, you might as well get used to it because this will be a feature of your life, good or bad. And basically, you can divide it up into 3 things. Ideas, basic principles. Basically, TRL 1 and 2 is a sodden bar napkin with scribbles on it. TRL 3 is when you actually get down to proving that the idea is possible, and some of that is on the bar napkin. And then what really costs a lot of time and headache and money is actually getting hardware that works and works in the environment that you want it to work in. And so this whole process of getting from TRL 3 to TRL 6 is not trivial. And then TRL 7, 8, and 9 is actually getting this in an operational environment and flying it. The feature here is that mission planners hate depending on anything that's TRL 3 for mission critical systems. And there's nothing wrong with this. This is just experience. This is what happens. If you want to develop flight hardware, it's going to be full of surprises. It's going to be full of unexpected failures, hidden costs, redesigns, retests, lost sleep, weekend work, and divorces. Because I wish it were different, but I've seen this with my own eyes. And so, quite reasonably, planners who want to design missions do not want to take anything seriously that isn't at TRL 6, because otherwise they realize that they're just getting themselves in trouble and vast numbers of headaches. This is sort of the way it works. You have a beautiful idea up here, and then you have to get into TRL 4 through 6, where the miracle occurs, and then you have technology you can use. And really, that's couldn't be true, more true. More work needs to be done at that step. Another issue is risk in development. We have this great quote about NASA, failure is not an option. That's good when you're dealing with operational things in real time, but if you're developing hardware, failure is always an option. It's what you do with hardware. The normal cycle is build it, test it, break it, fix it, test it, break it. Repeat over and over again until it actually works. Failures are only failures if you don't learn anything from your tests. And even in development, NASA does tend to be a little bit risk averse because it hates to be seen to be wrong on anything. And what drives me crazy is to be afraid of doing testing and breaking your hardware, because that's what you're supposed to do. That's a feature. It's not a problem. Go and test it, break it, see if it works. So what can we do? Well, political cycles are not going to change for us. People who spend political capital for space exploration are very rarely rewarded. And everybody knows what happened to Lyndon Johnson versus Dick Nixon. The gear ratio problem is physics. It's not going to go away. If you want to climb out of the gear ratio problem, the only way to do that is to drag less stuff into space. Launch costs are undergoing a revolution, and this is great. This is going to be a big boon to the future. But still, an order of magnitude drop just means that you're going from $10,000 a kilo to $1,000 a kilo. That's still not cheap. You're still not going to get away from that gear ratio problem. TRL is just a hard-won experience. You don't want to walk away from that. Otherwise, you're just going to get into problems. So if you want new technology, particularly ISRU technology, you're going to have to invest in a maturation process. And we do this in planetary science. We have a range of maturation programs because it does cost real money and it does take real effort. And of course, with risks, the only way to avoid failures is never do anything. And that's not what I want to do. I want to do stuff. So, what can we do? I would submit that the way to get the future moving closer is to beat down costs with the use of ISRU. Because if you're not dragging as much mass to the moon or Mars or to asteroids, you can do a lot more exploration. You can increase sustainability. You can increase your capabilities and mission performance. You reduce your risks. You increase the science that you can do. And you can support lots more destinations. So I ran an RSRU seminar last year with the help of Survey. And if you want to look at, we recorded all the sessions and a lot of the material. And that's available online at sciences.ucf.edu/class/ISRU. The problem we have with ISRU is that it's actually stuck in the technological valley of death between TRL-3, which is a good idea that will probably work, and TRL-6, which is something where with most of the bugs worked out. And there's this vicious cycle. The technology is always too immature to be included in mission planning. Without missions, there's no drive or money to mature the technology. Without ISRU, the missions become far too expensive to fly. And so you loop back around to the start and say, well, let's replan this, and then you come up with the same answer. So it's been 49 years since the moon landing, and we're still stuck in this infinite planning loop. What I'd suggest is that we need to break the loop. If you want to have ISRU as a tool, you need to mature the technology. Something like the competitive Picasso and Matisse programs that we see in the Science Mission Directorate. And get a mix of actors and a sustained program that can provide multiple approaches to the key problems in exploration and ISRU. And try to deliver a range of ISRU technologies that you can actually use to reduce cost and risk and have something for the mission planners to dig their teeth into. So that maybe in 5 years, you can have technology that dovetails with the new capabilities that these cheaper launchers are making available. And so you can have these things available for commercial actors in deep space and for deep space exploration. And ISRU can provide this critical link between our present and getting to the future. So just to summarize, there are things we can't change. We're not going to change political cycles. We don't want to change TRLs. Physics is not going to change for us, so the gear ratio problem is just that. The neat thing is that launch costs are coming down. With more programs and money, you can mature technologies in ISRU and get around the gear ratio problem. The simple thing is to get the dumb mass locally and make it possible to get and stay on the moon and Mars. Thank you. No questions? No denunciations either?
Well, not yet. Dan, Noah Petro, NASA Goddard, 2 points. I bet you Jack is thinking the same thing. Just in terms of history, LBJ started the defunding of the Saturn V production line. Nixon implemented it as well, so some of the blame should fall to LBJ. And in terms of political cycles
Sure.
that sort of highlight the problem that you say here, there's one person who you didn't mention who also deserves a great deal of credit for getting Apollo started, and that was Eisenhower.
Yes.
It all started on his program, and he is in the large-scale forgotten from Apollo, but it started under his administration. Kennedy implemented it and gave it a face, I'd say. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, I didn't want to give too much of a history lesson, but all true, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, I just would follow up on that. The primary, really early on after Sputnik, there were 3 players. Eisenhower sort of the leading it,
Yep.
but Johnson and McCormick in the House.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a bipartisan effort.
Yeah.
And then in January 1960, Ike told T. Keith Glennon, the then administrator of NASA, to begin the development of the super booster.
Yeah.
And so that development effort had over a year's head start
Yeah.
when Kennedy and Johnson were in the White House. Johnson was a very important player at that point in time, in that 1961 period. But it would have been very difficult to meet Kennedy's goal if that booster development had not been started sooner.
Yeah, so true.
Than the Kennedy announcement. And as Noah has indicated, the first proposal to limit production to 15 Saturn V's was out of the Johnson administration. Whether he knew it or not, or OMB did it on their own, I haven't been able to decipher. But that limitation meant the program was going to end.
Understood. Yeah, I always thought that Nixon, though, really enjoyed that proposal. He was not a big fan of Johnson.
Well, he may not have been a fan of Johnson, but he could have terminated the effort a lot sooner. And was persuaded to at least to continue it through Apollo 17. That's another story that got wrapped up in the election of 1972 to some degree, and George Low deserves a lot of credit. I give him credit for having persuaded him to delay the launch until after the election.
I never realized that.
2 final questions.
Okay, excellent talk, Dan. This is absolutely a critical enabling capability, ISRU. My point is that I think there's a lot of intelligent ways to bridge the valley of death, and we just came from our focus groups. I participated in the one led by Jen Heldman and Tim Glotch that's looking at field campaigns and analogs, and I offered that as one solution, certainly to maturing not just technologies, but integration of technologies, developing ConOps, developing new approaches such as usage of AR, VR, autonomy, et cetera. And I would just submit that there are all sorts of bright ways to more rapidly mature those technologies across that 4 to 6 level.
So true. One of the ways I've noticed that you don't mature technology is to build endless PowerPoint presentations.
Indeed.
Which is a feature of NASA.
One thing that I seem to have missed here that has changed over time that you didn't mention is the role and the power that OMB plays in the political cycles.
Yes.
And that might be something that you consider adding into your analysis, because there has been quite a shift over the last several decades.
Okay, good point.
Just bringing up the obvious, to raise the TRL level that we have right now for instruments, for example, in Picasso and Matisse and now Dali, there's a lot of good ideas out there, but what's really lacking is the funding. These are so competed that the selection ratios are so low where there's just a lot of lost ideas out there.
Yeah, that's why I would argue that you need to, and this is not a lot of money per year. It's, if you could just save one launch, you could basically fund a ISRU maturation program for 5 years.
Again, I also would like to thank you for the presentation. I was also present for the Nixon cancellation of the NASA Research Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1970, because why would they need a research center in Teddy Kennedy's district?
Yeah.
But one thing I might propose you think about adding to this list besides ISRU is ECLS, Ecological Closed Life Support Systems.
Okay.
For largely obvious reasons. One of the other things is at RAND in the 90s, we looked at what are the technologies you need for more extensive missions. That's one of them, but then look at how the technologies spin back to benefit Earth-based society, and we need to get an awful lot smarter about how we manage our food, energy, life support processes.
All true. And all of these things are fairly modest amounts of development money that pay huge dividends down the road in mission planning and simplicity and robustness and exploration. And I will get off.
No worries. So thank you again to